Welcome to the Week in Review, featuring comments and commentary on the people and the issues of the day. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Joining me on my panel are Genethia Hayes, who's the Executive Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Good to have you, Genethia.
Thanks.
Xandra Kayden, League of Women Voters President. Good to have you, newly elected. Allan Hoffenblum, a political strategist. Welcome back to the Week in Review. We were talking about the governor's race before, and we have a candidate who ran for governor last time around. Ron Unz, good to have you.
Hey, great to be here.
And you did it the old-fashioned way. You put your own money out from hard-earned approach. You weren't running around begging for bucks as much as you had a message to get out. Now you're back on the political radar screen with another message. It has to do with bilingual education. Explain.
Well, bilingual education has been tried for 25 years. It might have been good in theory, it just doesn't work in practice.
What is it, bilingual
It's
education?
the notion of teaching children first in their native language, and then only once they're ready starting to teach them English. And unfortunately, the result is the children are not learning English. And the truth is they end up becoming illiterate in 2 languages.
So what do we do?
My answer is basically to get rid of it. It just doesn't work. We've tried it for 25 years. And, you know, I certainly think parents who still believe it works for their children should be given the option of keeping their children in the program. But for the bulk of parents, the children should be taught English as soon as they start school.
And what about their interaction with their culture, their roots, and their family?
I think that's very important, but I think culture is more the responsibility of the family. And providing the tools to survive in our society and be productive is more the responsibility of the schools. And English, knowing how to read English, speak English, and write English, is absolutely essential to making it in our society.
Okay, why didn't it work?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, some people say it just, you know, hasn't been supported fully by all the teachers in the system. I think it just doesn't work in theory. When you're talking about taking a very complex system where children are being taught in 2 languages over different periods of time at different ages, I mean, teachers are basically normally dealing with simple ideas. You teach the child English, you teach the child math, you teach the child science. If the teachers are under all sorts of complicated restrictions as to what language they can introduce at what age, it gets too difficult. And I'm a scientist. I come from an empirical background. If something doesn't work in practice, that's the most important result. It just doesn't work. And I think we need to make sure children are taught English as soon as they start school.
What about it causing it where their other languages are not even dealt with anymore? Will we have pieces of paper that will have both languages on it in the future, or do you see removing that?
Well, I mean, on issues like that, I mean, it depends on the particular issue where I would stand. I think it's very important that people learn other languages, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, to make it in our, you know, shrinking world. But the most important thing is that they be taught English. And for little children, teaching them English in the public schools when they first start school should be very easy at 5 or 6 years old. Once they learn English, I think it's very good if they learn other languages as well. And certainly public documents, in many cases, should be made available in several different languages for older people. But the most important thing is that the children be taught English so that they can become integrated, assimilated, successful members of our society.
Okay, and I'm going to ask the panel to jump in, but what are you actually doing? You're going to put something on the ballot?
Absolutely. We're going to put an initiative on the 1998 June ballot, which essentially would reorient the state's public education system away from bilingual education and more towards sheltered English immersion for young children who don't speak the language. In other words, for a period of time, generally up to a year, they would be put in a special classroom with teachers who would be especially competent at bringing them up to speed in English, helping them over the first few months using signs, using some of their native language, using pictures, and then after a period of a short time they would become fluent in English, and then they could be mainstreamed in with the other children. My mother didn't speak a word of English until a year before she started elementary school, and she ended up graduating college in highest honors in English literature, and that I think is true of almost all of our immigrant ancestors, and that's what we have to get back to.
Panel. Alan.
Ron, you know, I've been very outspoken, particularly since the 1996 election, that the manner in which the Republican Party handled Prop 187, which I came out against, by the way, and I believe you did too,
Absolutely.
did you not? You came out against 187. But the manner in which we had it, there's a perception within the Latino community that the Republican Party is anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant. And when you're dealing with the bilingual education, obviously we have people from throughout the world, multi-cultures and languages, but the dominant one is from Latino immigrants who speak Spanish. What are you going to do to make sure, first of all, why isn't a Latino out in front talking about this, because I've seen surveys show the majority of them opposed to bilingual education. And we're going to make sure this is not another conservative Republican attempt to bash Mexicans, you know, quote, English only, to, you know, prevent that from just reinforcing the Latin American citizens that we Republicans are anti-Mexican or anti-immigrant.
I agree with you 100%. In fact, that is my single biggest concern in the campaign, to make sure it's not perceived as anti-immigrant or anti-Latino. And, you know, I come from a very, very strong pro-immigrant background, which gives me some capabilities in that regard. But certainly, there are a lot of other people I'm involving in the campaign who come from a wide variety of non-Anglo and Anglo backgrounds, but people who have very strong pro-immigrant credentials. And I think that's the most important thing. In other words, putting a Latino out front who might have a lot of doubts in people's minds as to whether he's, you know, in a sense, Uncle Tomas, in other words, a Latino who's opposed to the policies that benefit Latinos, I think is the biggest danger. There are tremendous support, I think, for this within the Latino community, just according to the polls you cited. And there are actually some very prominent Latinos who've already given me their support, and we'll be making that public quite shortly.
But what kind of educational research are you basing it on, in terms of the fact that, is it simply that you believe that the bilingual program is poorly constructed, the pedagogy's not there, the methodology's not there, or are you actually saying that you don't believe that there is any value whatsoever? And you've looked at educational research, you've looked at people who have, you know, for example, the work of Reynaldo Macias, who does the Language Institute for the UC Center. Are you basing it at all, or are you using criteria or evaluations or anything in educational research and theory and practice that says that bilingual education doesn't work?
Well, there's a lot of research on both sides of the issue, and that's one of the problems. In other words, a lot of the research really is funded by organizations that want to come to certain conclusions, and that's true of both sides. There seems to be more evidence that young children can very easily acquire fluency and literacy in English when they're taught English intensively in a sort of sheltered environment. And in fact, my co-proponent on the initiative, who is Latino, has a class where the children, when they come in, they're in the first grade, enter not knowing any English. And at the end of that, with a 99% success rate, they've learned English. And that's something, and they can read and write, and that's something that's supported by a lot of research data as well. Now, to give you an example, the contrast between that and the current system is that in the state of California right now, of the 1.3 million children who don't know English, that's a quarter of the entire public school population, only 5 or 6% learn English each year. And that's crazy. That's a disaster.
But there are all kinds of other variables that go into that statement. And what happens with the youngster who is well beyond 5 or 6, well beyond kindergarten? What happens with the youngster who comes in and they're in the middle school, or the youngster that comes in high school? Those kinds of students. How does this all work for them?
I agree 100%.